Thanks everyone for inviting me here. Just to embellish that a little bit, what I do is essentially work across sort of three areas. I spend about a third of my time working in the public sector, generally looking after strategy and innovation areas in central agencies. I spend about a third of my time in the political sphere, generally as a senior advisor to on strategy to either a Prime Minister or a Premier. And I spend a third of my time, and most of my time now, working with ministers or with secretaries at the interface of politics and policy, typically around sort of major reform challenges where there's a bit of a disconnect between, particularly between the, say, a cabinet and a public service. So it's an unusual space, and it kind of offers you a few sort of interesting perspectives that you might not get from being on one side of the fence or the other. What I'll talk about today is framed around the idea of large-scale innovation. By large-scale innovation, I mean innovation at the level of systems or societies. So it could be the economic development of a region or a country. It could be reform of a health system or an education system or an environmental system. What I'll talk about, first of all, I'll talk about the idea of sort of the new types of challenges we face in systems, in policy, and particularly around the idea of wicked problems and how do we innovate in complex systems, and a couple of models of that. Then I'll move on to the innovation space, to innovation as an example of one of those complex systems. And I'll introduce what we call the Scrabble theory of economic development, which is the simplest possible explanation of something that's quite complex and quite a profound sort of simplification of something that's actually quite profound. I'll talk a little bit about some of the basic data on Australian innovation. Most recently, in the past year, I worked very closely with the Minister for Innovation in Canberra and the Innovation Department in Canberra in the development of the Federal Government's Innovation Strategy, and prior to that, played a similar role with the Victorian Government's Innovation Strategy. I also advised in the context of both the US Government's Innovation Strategy and also I'm about to go over, as Gavin said, to talk about institutions around innovation in the UK. So that's kind of the area that I guess I know most and have the most experience. And then I want to sort of open it up a lot more and just put on the table some different, an outsider's perspective on some of the issues facing South Australia. I'll stop at a couple of points along the way and take questions as we go. But if there is anything that I'm saying as we're going that you really feel like you need to jump in on, feel free to do that as well. First of all, there's a lot of discussions that we see around the place about the sort of the underlying forces that are changing economy, reshaping economies and societies. So these are typically framed as global forces or mega trends. This particular group is the grouping that we developed as part of the National Sustainability Council, which put out the first Sustainable Australia report, which is sort of a measurement of sustainable wellbeing about 6 months ago. The one thing I would point to here, a number of these reports point to the types of problems we face in our infrastructure and city systems, in our resource systems, in our economic systems and social systems, and point to challenges whereby the nature of the challenges are such that governments can't solve the problems by themselves. So there's systems that involve distributed actions of many players, require the support and the buy-in of many different players, whether it's businesses, communities, citizens, but they're also dynamic and uncertain systems, whereby the problems and the nature of the problems change with events. The one thing we did different through the National Sustainability Council was put the idea of connectedness at the heart of the discussion of complexity. With the idea being that in complex, highly specialised economies, societies with diverse needs and preferences, the idea of the strength of connections actually becomes a really powerful antidote to complexity, which I'll come back to. The problem that I come across when I talk to colleagues around Australia and around the world that have responsibility for large-scale reform of systems is that they feel held back, that there's a gap between the capabilities and the culture within the public sector on the one hand, and the rising complexity and difficulty of the issues and the rising expectations of citizens and stakeholders on the other. And there's a in many cases, a number of these issues are such that there's a sense that there's kind of almost a bit of a helplessness amongst public sector leaders. How do you reform big systems? It seems too hard. Some of those capability gaps in extreme cases, so in the Australian context, I would talk about asylum seeker policy, I would talk about climate change policy. If it was the US, you'd talk about health reform. In the UK, you would talk about the big society idea of David Cameron. Some of those problems, some of those challenges get into a state where they get caught in a vicious cycle. And you go from a situation of a capability gap to almost a low innovation equilibrium where there's a trap that you can't get out of. And that's sort of what happens is you have the start with the capability of gap. It's too difficult to deal with. A consequence of that is what you actually do doesn't work, doesn't change the outcome, in turn eroding the confidence of citizens and the community that you're actually capable of solving the problem. That then comes back on you and makes it harder for you to actually do anything to solve the problem. So you're caught in this trap. So how do you get out of these kind of traps? I'll back up one step. How can it be that we can be caught in these kind of traps? This is a framework put together by Lant Pritchett, formerly of the World Bank, and it's really a critique of how it is that public systems get caught with persistent underperformance that in many cases nobody seems to notice, and if they do notice, nobody seems to penalise. And essentially, while it's a more complex framework, he points to the essential differences between public systems, weak public systems, and private markets. And private markets don't have the same, public systems don't have the same disciplines around creative destruction. New providers can't easily enter, consumers can't always vote with their feet, as they can in private markets. And the two outstanding factors for underperformance persisting are one, do the leaders of the public organisation, are they held accountable for public outcomes as opposed to private outcome? Public outcomes as opposed to their own little patch that they've got responsibility for. Secondly, is the organisational culture open to experimentation, innovation, novelty, different ways of doing things? And the emphasis here is on the culture, not the system, not the rules of the game, not what leaders say, but how the culture actually works. Is there a genuine openness to doing things differently inside the organisation? And when you don't have these things, it's very easy to see how underperformance persists in public systems. The traditional weight of evidence on how do you solve large-scale reform problems comes from the OECD, and it's based on analysis of the major reforms over the past 30 or so years across a number of countries, where, and this is particularly the case for a country like Australia, where the nature of those reforms have been such that you can tweak the policy levers to get the outcome, where the policy makers themselves could change the rules of the game, and that would be sufficient to get the outcome. Opening of reduction of trade barriers or opening of borders, for example, where the policy lever makes the difference. The creation of competition policy and competitive markets or flexible markets, where the policy lever can change the outcome. The difficulty is, and in those cases, what you find, if you've got the combination of political leadership and drive that wants to get something done, and you do the hard analytical work around the nature of the problem, you can generally structure the engagement and structure the process where you can get the reform up and you can get the reform done. The difficulty is that's a formula that applies for those systems where the policy makers can do it themselves. It's a harder situation when you've got a situation where you've actually got to affect the behaviours and the attitudes and the cultures of a range of different players. You've got to affect business behaviour or community behaviour or citizen behaviour. This is a picture of John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes, as I was growing up as a policy advisor and a public servant, Keynes was basically my hero. Actually, when I was about 15 years old, I used to read Keynes. It's absolute nerdish, but I used to think that's what I wanted to be. That's, you know, you want to be kind of, in his own words, you want to be the expert in everything. You want to have sort of the knowledge and the expertise in every possible area and be able to think multiple things at once and different time frames at once and so on. And then the more that you actually get stuck into policy, the more you realise that actually nobody can do it themselves. Nobody can have all of this expertise. Even if you do, you would always want to incorporate different perspectives, and you realise that this model is actually anathema to innovation in systems, because innovation in systems require very different perspectives and interaction of different perspectives. So this model that I once aspired to, I think is a load of rubbish in system reform. This relates to a piece of work that's going on at the moment at the Kennedy School at Harvard, where there are different models of change that are being developed. This model is essentially the idea of solution and leader-driven change, or expert-driven change, where it's the leader or the expert that's guiding what needs to be done and how you affect change. The alternative, which I call the real world, is how most innovation actually takes place in these more complex systems. And that is what's clumsily referred to as problem-driven iterative adaptation, PDIA, but essentially it rejects the idea that there is an expert with knowledge or one example of how things should be done that should simply be replicated across a range of different contexts. It rejects the idea that what you need to do is lay out a plan and then just implement that plan and monitor your progress against that plan. And it rejects the idea that systems change based on the directions that come from a hierarchy. The alternative is that most innovation actually involves solving real-world problems in their specific context. It requires experimentation, it requires trying to do different things and doing things differently, and it requires not grabbing that and seeking to replicate, but observing it and adapting it for a range of different situations. And it fundamentally relies on people in communities and networks interacting as opposed to the traditional hierarchy. My problem is that I think this is how we do most policy in the public sector. And yet these are the problems we're dealing with in the public sector. Not a new idea. Wicked problems don't go away. This is Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. Problems worthy of attack prove their worth by hitting back. That is, they change as you actually try and go after them. Examples, if you think about how we've achieved a great deal in Australia in areas such as road safety or smoking, where it's required behavioural change and attitudinal change on behalf of people, you'll look at those campaigns and what you notice is they evolve. For a couple of years, they might be around different aspects of behaviour around road safety or smoking. Might move into a taxation space and so on. You always have to evolve the strategy as it's actually working on people and as people's attitudes and behaviours are changing. This is not how we conventionally think of public policy, where we devise a strategy, we have a 5-year plan, we say we've got the answer, and the answer won't change in the next 5 years, and then we implement the plan. Real world systems don't work like that. But it's not an argument that public sector leaders are helpless. There are things that I think we can do that are really important in affecting changing systems. The first and the two big ones are around how we frame problems. First of all, framing as and, not or. So not breaking problems up into so many parts that we miss the connections between the parts. So if you've got a problem with 4 key dimensions, if you break it up and ask someone different to solve each of the 4 dimensions, and you don't recognise the linkages within a system, chances are you're not really going to be solving the systemic problem. And the key in that case is to embrace as much complexity as you can manage. And I'll come back to that as you can manage point. Secondly, the type of leadership and the how. And this is where, because it affects the behaviour of others, because you need the buy-in of others, it needs to be a mindset of with, not for, both in policy formulation and in policy delivery. And in that case, the key is embracing as much diversity in terms of stakeholders as you can manage. This is a super important point. The biggest problem that I've found over the years working with leaders and working with experts is that experts and leaders want to solve the hardest problem. And sometimes that gets them into a space where they're trying to solve problems today that can't be solved today. This takes you to sort of the Roger Martin point. Roger Martin is the head of the School of Management at Rotman School at University of Toronto, and one of the best design thinkers in the world, one of the best innovation thinkers in the world. His big sort of point about strategy is do the most important thing that you can. So it takes a judgment call about not just picking the most important issue for society that you would like to solve at that point in time, but using your judgment about what can you solve at a point in time. Issues are at different levels of social maturity or readiness to be solved by policy. This is a tool developed by an outfit in Melbourne called FutureEye, and it's called a wiki curve. Essentially, but it's not actually that complex. All it is the idea that issues go through different stages of public debate, public acceptance, and readiness for a policy solution. And this, to me, is what political leaders in particular, but often also public sector leaders and experts that are very good at policy struggle to get their heads around. Some issues are simply at a stage where they're not ready for policy resolution. It's why, for example, we choose to send a number of issues off to a Productivity Commission inquiry, or set up a task force, or set up a review, because there's more work that's got to be done to get to a level of shared understanding about the nature of the problem before we jump in with a policy solution. Thoughts? Questions?